thank you for introducing me, and thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. My first time in Cuernavaca. I apologize for my inability to speak Spanish, even though I'm one of the Latino faculty research board. I didn't learn that my family's from Puerto Rico. I didn't learn that until about 6 years ago, after my parents were dead. I saw where they were born on their birth certificate. So anyway, I'm happy to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is a book project that I'm working on. So it's going to be broad and very much on the surface. And hopefully during questions, you could ask me more specific things about what I'll say during the talk. Right. So here's the basic idea. I'm going to talk about synesthesia and empathy, and then some phenomenology. What I usually do. Here's what Tony does. He reads Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, people like that, and looks for insights that can be brought into experimental design. Is there something in Merleau-Ponty that makes predictions that we might be able to test in the lab? So that's this first part is the phenomenology. Interpersonal synergies is a way we can bring the very abstract ideas of phenomenological philosophers into a laboratory setting. And finally, this is a strange thing. I'm going to basically argue that given a series of experiments happening over the last decade in the cognitive sciences, especially in embodied cognition and social cognition, that humans are necessarily, fundamentally embodied and with others. Now, it's 2022, right? Feminist philosophers have been saying this since the 1990s. Right? So I'm going to point out that we cognitive scientists are slow to the party. Okay, here we go. So am I muted? Because I have second. Let's see what happens. He's muted. It's coming out of here. Can you hear that?
No, really.
All right. Okay. We're gonna have echo. So this is a film by an artist named Daria Martin from Oxford, and she calls it the sensory interference test, which is the name of the test that people use to diagnose what's called mirror touch synesthesia. Mirror touch synesthesia is a new synesthesia, first reported, I believe, in 2006. And when you experience mirror touch synesthesia, people don't think of it as a kind of malady of any kind or an illness of any kind, or it's just something that some people experience. And what happens when you have mirror touch synesthesia is you experience touches on other bodies as if they are on your body. And I don't know if you saw, there was someone tapping the side of a speaker. For some people who have this condition, tapping inanimate objects also makes them feel things on their body. So you can imagine how different the lives of people who have this are from yours and mine. They couldn't go watch a Marvel Universe movie because the violence, they feel the violence on their bodies. Right? So, and they also, some of the people who report on this, and I'll just say this and leave it there. There are erotic aspects to this as well. Right? So people report when they see lovers who haven't seen each other for a hug on the street, they feel it. They feel that kind of jolt. In the same way that the people presumably do when they are having a feeling. And just Daria Martin published a book. It's called Mirror Touch Synesthesia in 2018, and it includes a bunch of interviews with people who experience mirror touch synesthesia. And here's one. The person says, "When I was a child, I had this strange belief that we were all meant to share consciousness. All meant to share consciousness with each other, almost a kind of mass telepathy. I remember thinking it was so strange it would each only experience our minds and not those of others. Here's another person who experiences mere touch synesthesia. I'm not sure that it would be appropriate to say that I confuse my sensations with those of other people. But at times, it most definitely seems as though I'm feeling through another person. It can be utterly devastating at times, and before it was discovered that I had this particular type of synesthesia, I thought I just suffered from really intense sporadic empathy. And empathy is the lens with which I first started trying to make sense of mirror touch synesthesia. I'm going to argue that actually that's not the right way to make sense of it, and that this is the right way to make sense of mirror touch synesthesia. We have to learn and not to experience the experiences of others. That's a kind of developmental thing that we eventually are able to do. But when we're and mirror touch synesthetes, for better or worse, mostly that people who experience this thing for better don't learn that. Okay. So, this really intense sporadic empathy. Empathy in English is a new word. It's not, it was coined by Titchener when he translated Wilhelm Wundt's idea of Einfühlung, which, so it's 1909, it's, just barely 100 years old. And Einfühlung, if you translate it literally, is feeling into things. We feel into things. And it was used mostly to talk about, initially, our experiences of artworks. How is it that you are moved by music or a painting? It wasn't until Theodor Lipps is the person, that's Heidi, that's not Heidi. Well, Theodor Lipps was the first person to use the word with respect to people. So empathy, this Einfühlung, you feel into each other. Again, this was in the early 20th century, barely 100 years ago. And I think this is an important thing to remember, given the prominence with which we discuss empathy in psychology and philosophy and moral psychology and so on. It's a new word, it's made up, it's a made up word. So it's not as if it has its original meaning from scripture or something. All right, so, okay, that's way too far. So Heidi Maybaum is a colleague of mine at the University of Cincinnati. She's probably moving away forever. We're very sad. But she's been my colleague for a while. And when I told her about mirror touch synesthesia and empathy, does anyone know Heidi? So Heidi is from Denmark. And in Denmark, they learn English, all of them, very well, but they don't learn it the same way that native English speakers learn English. So curse words don't have the same impact on them. So Heidi swears like a sailor. And when I told her this, her response was, "Fuck that shit, Tony." That's not empathy. Mirror touch synesthesia is not empathy. To have empathy, you need to know that the other person is different from you. You need to know what's happening to the other person. You need to use that knowledge to simulate or theorize about the experiences of the other. So it's not this kind of immediate feeling of impacts on their body. It is thinking. It's a kind of careful kind of thinking about it. So, like he says, mirror touch synesthesia is not, and almost everybody I've ever talked to says it's not. So I made something up to name what I do. I call it sensory motor. So it's really what it's doing is combining the two trendiest words in philosophy of cognitive science, for one. But for another, it's a more basic way that we feel into other people without saying, that person got hit with a ball. If I were hit with a ball, that would be painful, therefore they must be in pain. This is a more direct experience of the minds of others. And as I said, what I'm going to argue following phenomenologists is that we are with other people fundamentally. We're not separate from them. So sensory motor is a thing I made up to argue with Heidi. What it is, it's a kind of non-reflective, implicit, skillful engagement with others. So you don't know you're doing it. You're not consciously aware that you're doing it typically. And it's definitely skillful, because you all know people who can't do it, right? You know people who, when you're having a conversation with them, you just feel awkward because they're not responding by moving their bodies and changing the intonations of their voices in the way that you are. And so you experience this. You know people who can't do this well, so it has to be a skill. All right. So, given my background, I immediately thought of this feeling into this sensory motor empathy in terms of Heidegger. And Heidegger argues that most of our interaction with the world is what he calls skillful coping, or what Hubert Dreyfus calls skillful coping with entities ready to hand. So things that, the idea is, most of your interaction with the world is not sitting and solving puzzles. It's riding your bicycle, it's dancing with somebody, it's walking through the kitchen without falling down or bumping into things. Those are entities that you experience as ready to hand. Heidegger called this being with. We typically treat other people as ready to hand as well. That is, when you are driving your car, crazy driving, by the way, in Mexico City. When you drive your car, you don't notice or care about the other people in the car. The car is something that's in your way, right? It's not oh, look, it's a red Honda driven by a person with a mustache, right? That's not how you experience it. It's just something in the way. That's readiness to hand. Heidegger said that we experience others this way as well. Most of our dealings with other people is smooth and skillful. So smooth and skillful that we don't actually often notice it. So, if I say, hey, did you get a cup of coffee at the cafe this morning? You'll say, yes, of course I did. And then if I start asking you detailed questions about the person who served you the coffee, you will likely have no idea. Because it went so smoothly that you didn't have to stop and think. That's the kind of phenomenon that I'm interested in. So the idea is what we're feeling into one another. We are experiencing one another with what I call sensory motor empathy. It's sensory motor, by the way, to tell you this. It's sensory motor because it has to do with how we control our bodies with respect. So what Heidi calls cognitive empathy, or just empathy, I call cognitive empathy, because empathy that I made up, is when the person at the cafe doesn't speak a language I speak, or when the person at the cafe is rude to me, or doesn't serve me what I ordered. Only then do I kind of notice. I have to think about what was that person thinking when they gave me so much sugar in my coffee. So that's one version of this. Another is from late Merleau-Ponty, another phenomenological philosopher. And this is very late Merleau-Ponty. This was not published in his lifetime, but called the Résumé du Cours, so it's lecture notes from his teaching. And this is for people who speak French. I'll leave there for just a second. There was not an easily available English translation of this, and I was very proud that with my university French I could translate. Exciting moment. So here's how I translated it. And the key phrase, the key sentences are here. The self is inherent in the world, and the world is inherent with the self. Are people familiar with Merleau-Ponty? Actually, late in his career, he talked about flesh all the time. And flesh is kind of like my body and my mind and your body and your mind. And it's all really just one thing. This is what he's expressing. The world's inherent in the self, and the self is inherent in the world, and the world is inherent in the self. And the self is inherent in the other, as the other is inherent in the self. What Husserl calls the ineinander. Ineinander literally means in one another. So we are inside one another. That's the claim. And I'll point out that I did eventually find a published English translation of this. And it left out all the bits about the other. It just said the self is inherent in the world and the world is inherent in the self, what Husserl calls the inner. I'm much more interested in the self and other inside of me. That sounds more crass than I intended. So that's how I translate it. And what I'm going to talk about now is how we try to study this in the lab, how we try to study this kind of phenomenon, this kind of being connected to other people that mirror touch synesthetes don't ever unlearn. And we actually don't unlearn it either, especially when we're dealing with things just fine. So I'm going to talk about how we find that. And I was told, that science is bad. Psychology is bad in lots of ways. We've already found basically everything we could find in the survey we found. Everything we could find with the Skinner box we found. Right? All the low-hanging fruit has been by the kinds of methods that you learn in your introductory courses, methodology and statistics, in your basic modeling courses, and hopefully at some point you're all engaged with rodents. That was my favorite thing to teach was rats. And so we've already found all the easy things. The second problem with cognitive science and psychology is that people have this idea that they know how the mind works. So many of you are master's students in cognitive science, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have this experience where you tell your parents or your grandmother what you're working on, and they say, that's not how thinking works. Right? So there's this kind of thing that we believe that we have to be able to explain thinking, because everyone already knows what it is. They better be able to understand our scientific theories. That's the second problem. We found all the easy stuff. We have to explain it we seem to have to explain it in a way that's really easy for people to understand. And so here's the low-hanging fruit. We've already gathered that. If you want to gather stuff more up the tree, the interesting stuff, you have to use new methods. Methods that you might not be able to explain to your grandmother, unless your grandmother's a physicist. Does anyone have a grandmother who's a physicist? So again, we need new methods. We've done all the easy stuff. And so what I try to do in this case is to operationalize, that is, make into something we could experiment on in the lab, these kinds of ideas from Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. And I put this in quotes because another way in which, science in general is bad, is that in order to explain anything, we have to dramatically simplify. Mm-hmm. So much so that it's kind of boring by the time we're studying. And again, just think about all of the work in physics that's done in particle chambers with very, very small numbers of particles. There's a big leap from there to the similar particles in this room, right? So I'm going to oversimplify these extremely rich ideas from Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty in order to make them something we could access. So, and again, what I'm trying to do is get this kind of phenomenological ideas. This is the analogy. This is what I want. The ineinander relates to evidence I can gather the same way that particles in nature relate to particles in gas chamber. That's the best I think I can do. But that's pretty good. Right? I mean, physicists, people think they're cool. I'm talking about them. I think they're cool. All right. So what I'm going to call interpersonal synergies and human tool synergies are evidence for the ineinander, the feeling into things, the in one another. Self in the world and the world in the self. These are called synergies and interpersonal synergies are evidence for that. And what's called complexity matching is evidence for sensory motor empathy. I'm not going to give you any evidence about complexity matching today. It would take a long time to explain complexity matching, even to cognitive scientists, even not familiar. All right, so this is my toilet. You saw one. Actually, I've been showing this video. This is 2 toilets ago. I haven't lived in this house for a long time. So when you saw that when the toilet flushes, there's a familiar pattern
of activity occurs in the water molecules. They form a whirlpool. And, you know, we know that it isn't that the chief water molecule said, hey, everybody, let's do this. That's not what happens. What happens is that there's a potential energy gradient from the water in the toilet tank, and you release that, and that has to be dissipated. And so what happens is that energy that has to be dissipated causes some organization, making the water molecules as individual water molecules behave in very statistically unlikely ways. Most times they're not going around like this. So they're constrained to act along with one another as a single unit by the energy gradient. That's a synergy. Scott Kelso defines it this way: a synergy is a functional group of elements which are temporarily constrained to act as a unit. Right? Because once that potential energy gradient is gone, the water molecules go back to acting in the way that typical water molecules act. Synergies are what complex system science study. And what's interesting, again, is that what seems to occur is that the whirlpool, which is nothing more than water molecules, constrains the activity of those very same water molecules. So being part of the whirlpool, again, the whirlpool is just water molecules, changes the way the water molecules move. That's a synergy, and this is the kind of thing that drives like analytic metaphysics people insane. You make something, you are part of something, and that thing causes some changes in your behavior. But that's a toilet. That's the most mundane thing, a good invention, I suppose, but a really mundane, like we see this every day. So these things that many analytic metaphysics people think are logically impossible, in fact, occur all around us. That's a synergy. Now, again, whirlpools are synergy. Bird flocks are synergies. Basically, every living thing is a synergy. Right? Think about this. You are something that exists at distant from equilibrium with the environment. It requires using lots of energy to maintain the organization of your body. That's what a synergy is. This is a phrase from Michael Anderson, who wrote a book called After Phrenology, which I couldn't recommend enough. It's a really great book on neuroscience. This is transiently active, locally organized neural subsystems. So the idea is that when you want to reach for that thing that you see, the activities of your brain that like to get involved in seeing, this way Mike talks, he thinks we should get rid of functions of brain areas and say that they have personalities, something more like personalities. So the parts of your brain that like to get involved in seeing and the parts of your brain that like to get involved in grabbing things form a temporary unit. They do start firing at a cooperative rate, a cooperative frequency, temporarily until you grab something and they both relax to their preferred way of being. So that's a talent. Bird flocks are exactly the same thing. I'm going to explain this way. Your organs are all synergy, right? Your organs are a set of cells that are constrained to act together temporarily. You are synergy too. What's interesting, this is from my colleague Mike Riley, these pictures as well, is that you can also have synergies that occur between people. And this is what they study in the lab. Mike Riley, Mike Richardson, Veronica Ramansoni, and many others, people who wrote that initial paper. They said, look, you have two actors, and you apply some constraints to them, like there's music and they're dancing together. That constraint causes a synergy that includes parts of both of the human actors. And this here is like basically says, you study this using what's called time series analysis. Time series analysis, are this familiar? Ish, okay. So again, the idea is you measure the same thing repeatedly, and then you do a bunch of hideous mathematics to try to make sense of the patterns of activity. And this is how you find synergies. This is the methodology for finding synergies, including interpersonal. So examples of interpersonal synergies are dancing, walking, having a conversation. And another bit of work I would want to recommend here is from Alexandra Paxton. And she studies the way people form interpersonal synergies when they have conversations. So she will have two people who are talking stand on force platforms and measure the ways that their center of pressures coordinate over time. And you can actually read off the level of coordination of the centers of pressure, whether the people are agreeing in the conversation or disagreeing in the conversation. It's a really, really remarkable phenomenon. All right, so here, it might be, this is some experiments that my student Ashley Wall. Let's see how that echoes. Because this is kind of cool. So you don't get to hear this. What Ashley did is Ashley managed to get 24 pairs of professional jazz pianists into the lab. Now, in a city the size of Cincinnati that doesn't have a robust jazz culture, this is in itself a feat. But it turns out that they like doing this. The jazz pianists like doing this. She pays them $25 for 4 hours of playing together in a bunch of different conditions, and then sitting for interviews together and separately. So Ashley, who's now a postdoc at Dartmouth University, I like to say that because it reflects well. Ashley got all these people in here, and she had them play along with different backing tracks. And sometimes, but not always, she pulled a curtain between them so they couldn't see each other but could only hear each other. I'll tell you that there are 3 backing tracks. One was what's called an ostinato, which had a time signature that was very difficult for them to. I think it was 5/4. Not too difficult, but not comfortable either. So they actually, after the first couple pairs, would refuse to play over it the second time. Like, no, stop. We're not doing this. We dropped that condition. We also dropped the condition with the curtain. This is very surprising because when you start looking at the data, there is no difference in the patterns of movement of the people playing, whether the curtain's there or not. So you only need one kind of information to coordinate one another. I mean, you can see here that they are all motion capture censored. Here's the second part of that improvisation. And so again, the ostinato we got rid of. There was a standard blues track, jazz standard track. It wasn't a blues actually. There is no greater love. And then the other one was just a drum. So the most interesting behavior among the participants. And if you think about the song "There Is No Greater Love," it's been played hundreds of times, recorded hundreds of times by all the great jazz musicians. And jazz musicians are historians, right? So they have their activity is constrained by all the past playings of the saxophone solo in that song. So what we found is that's too much constraint for them to perform. So what we're going to look at are from the drone. This is just typical pair of participants. All right, so this is a result of what's called a wavelet modulus maximum analysis. And I feel really good just saying that out loud, like I was involved in something. So what it is a measure of, and by the way, this is this pair. What wavelet does is this gives you, here's 60 seconds of playing. Here are going up are or going down are larger and larger chunks of that 60 seconds. So here are 16-second intervals at the bottom, right? And up the top it's quarter second intervals. The heat of the color is an indication of the strength of the coordination. The direction of the arrows is an indication of the phase of the coordination. So this way is perfectly in phase. This way is perfectly out of phase. So, yeah, cool.
Up and down. The arrow.
Up and down means that they are playing. So imagine a circle, right? So this is 0 degrees. Right? Up and down is basically as far out of sync as you can get.
The
Because
difference between the phase of the ball.
say that again.
The difference between the phases.
This is a phase difference. Yeah, this is a collective variable. So this is head movements. This looks like this where they can see each other. So notice that over long temporal scales, there's very little in the way of coordination. But at between a quarter and a half second intervals, they are very, very strongly coordinated in phase. And this is important thing in the drone training, because the drone doesn't have a time signature. So the people reported that, well, in that case, we had to create a time signature. That's what this is, they're creating the time signature. Yeah.
What kind of data is this? This muscle, it's EG?
It's with a data called a polymus. So it's body position data. So it's you know. So sensor. They have a sensor in their belt you can't see. She didn't do it with their legs. Just so much data. But I mean, these are sampling at thousands of times a second. So basically, what it is relative position of limbs. That help?
Yeah, okay.
So, in contrast, by the way, this is the interpersonal synergy. Thank you. Right? In contrast, if you look at right arm movements, and the right arm is the melody, you see very little coordination other than between about 16 and 24 seconds, at periods of about 4 seconds. So basically you see about 3 cycles of this, of very, very strong, very anti-phase coordination. So they're playing against one another with the melody, while they're simultaneously nodding their heads. And if you think, I just talked about Alexander Paxton. You know, if you think about this is the way that people are swaying with respect to one another. This is the conversation. Right? And the key point I'm trying to make is that this is how we typically stick to one another. If you ask them, they won't tell you that they were nodding their heads along with one another, perfectly in phase over quarter second intervals.
They won't tell you? Or
No, they won't. No, they say no. They won't. They're not aware that they're doing it, but it's a kind of bodily engagement with each other that's required for the coordination patterns for this interesting bit. And you couldn't hear it, but it was funny. Like they were laughing at the end.
And that goes with curtain.
Well, this trial they didn't have curtain, but yes, you get the same phenomenon. So this is only the with the drum. The other conditions, the ostinato, as I said, they did not like playing to that. They often refused to do it the second time. And with a jazz standard song that they all played hundreds of times, they also were very highly constrained by the way Miles Davis played it a long time. So that's the kind of experiments that you can do to try to make sense of how we are with one another.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
In the right, in the bottom of the picture, you have like the left arrows. That it means that they are like an antiphase, right?
Except for that, this is on a circle, right? So they are antiphase, but if you get antiphase enough, you're back in phase. Right? So yes, they're antiphase. They're antiphase.
Do you have like these colors of the blood of the heat map, like too high? What happened?
I don't know. I don't know what happened to this trial. Again, 24 pairs, 12 planes, thousands of data points per second times 4. Well, there's a lot, so I don't know what's going on now. I mean, I don't know that it's especially remarkable. They're playing against one another, but this is over a very long chunk of time. This is over a quarter of the trial. So again, it's, I think what they're doing is they're preparing for this. If you ask me what to interpret it, as far as what data analysis we could do to the data to figure out what that is, I All right. So I didn't really tell you anything about complexity matching. What wavelet analysis can do, among many other things, is a measure of complexity. And complexity is basically patterns in the variability of something. So you measure the way people move, and then you delete the average and just look at the noise around the average, the variability around the average. And when you have a complex system, what you have is coordinating patterns of variability around the average at multiple time scales. So, and if you think about your heart is a very tightly connected thing, right? So imagine that your left ventricle has a little hiccup of some kind. It beats off a little bit offbeat. Then that error is going to reverberate around the heart and have effects at long time scales. And that's what complexity matching is. So that's what complexity is. Complexity matching is that what Alexander Paxton did is that you see people matching this weird abstract property of their behavior in order to coordinate them. And Bruce West is the one who has a 75-page paper that's all equations that shows, as far as he tells us, that complexity matching is actually just guaranteed high efficiency information. So that shows. Again, I won't pretend to have much okay. So there's this thing about our movement, complexity, or about lots of things, complexity. Now, you don't know what the complexity of your own movements are now. You don't know what the complexity of the person you're having a conversation with movements are. Yet nonetheless, when you're having a successful interaction, they match. That's the sense in which this is implicit. I couldn't tell you, oh yeah, the age index is 0.68 right now. I couldn't tell you that. Age index, that's scholarly. Hurst index, the Hurst index, it begins with an H, not that long. The Hurst index is 0.6. Did I say 0.68? I couldn't tell you that about myself or about you. Yet we will both have it in the vicinity of 0.68. That's complexity matching. That's what I said. By the way, I talked about hearts. Loss of complexity, loss of this weird pattern of interaction over time, multiple time scales, is a really bad thing for things like your heart or your brain. Arthur Winfrey is going to show that if you lose the complexity in your heartbeat over the course of an afternoon, you should go directly to the hospital. You're likely to have cardiac arrest.
So if your heart beats too regularly, it's signal a problem, right?
So partly that, but what it really is that if your heartbeat, there are going to be fluctuations in any system, especially biological. If the fluctuations don't percolate through the system, it indicates that the parts aren't very well coordinated. Right? So what you actually get is like genuine random fluctuations. And when their complex systems are not quite random, but unpredictable. That helps.
Sure, and that makes also sense comparing like a jazz saxophonist and the machine playing. But yeah, that makes one big difference, right?
Yeah, one of my current PhD students, Zach Peck, his name is doing work now trying to figure out whether making it so that artificial intelligence interacts with you in this complexity matching way while you're playing a game makes you trust. We've done some experiments like over time. We played a video game on a tabletop. It was like basically virtual sheep herding, and so the kind of key finding is that in order to be good at herding these 5 to 7 sheep to the center of the monitor and keep them there, you have to basically ignore the sheep and pay attention to each other. That you have to like do this together, so you're containing them. That's the key finding. But what Zach is doing, Zach, is he's trying to look at situation. Sorry. The second thing we did is we just did a mathematical model of doing this, and then we use that to replace a person in a virtual environment. And it plays really well with people. But Zach is right now going back through that data to see if there are differences in complexity matching between the model of humans and humans, and we expect to find that. And it would be really weird if we didn't, because the AI isn't sensitive to complexity in any way. So Zach proposes that we could get better AI. AI alignment. That is, artificial intelligence aren't just big clusters of full of spaghetti neural network. That we can actually understand what they're doing and align our interests with the artificial intelligence. If we can make artificial intelligence that in interacting with people matches complexity. That's Zach's work. It's really cool, and the great thing about that is since it's my student, I'll get my name on something. Yeah. All right. So again, we form interpersonal synergies by matching complexity. And there's, this is 4 or 5 years ago, this list of things that Fred Hasselman, who's a big complexity matching booster, but tweeted or Facebooked. And this list just gets longer and longer and longer and longer. So when we're walking together, we match complexity with one another. When we row together, we match complexity with one another. When we're in conversation, when we do other kinds of interpersonal coordination, when we're doing joint decision tests, in order to do that, we have to match one another's complexity. And this could be in any kind of embodied activity. It could be in the intonation of my voice. It could be in the way that I'm swaying. It could be in the word choice. It could be in, it could be in anything, right? So basically any movement that's going well seems to involve complexity matching. Again, complexity matching, as I said, is necessarily implicit and non-reflective. We can't reflect on it. Maybe we could, if we try really hard with biofeedback, we can get good at understanding complexity of our activity. But there's so far, no one has done that. So here's the summary of this so far. Is that first, these synergies between people result from their non-reflective, skillful interactions. And we do this with one another in a way that the mirror touch synesthete understood. We are with them in a very, very deep way that's so deep in us. And we all do this, almost all of us do this, that's so deep in us that we can't even talk about it. So others feel separate from us. Mathematically speaking, if you do a model, they're not separate when you're engaged in certain kinds of coordination. This is the most basic form of empathy, not fuck that shit, Heidi empathy. And what I'm trying to suggest is that this bodily engagement is exactly the way that Heidegger, and especially Merleau-Ponty, would. This is the most basic way we are with one another, by matching one another's complexity, by forming synergies, by forming units that are constrained to act together temporarily. That's the most basic way we're with one another. And that's what the person who said, the mirror touch synesthete said, I just thought it was weird that I didn't have everyone else's thoughts as I got older. So this is the kind of basic embodiment, being with others. All right, that's the story so far. Oh, there's another thing. All right, we can do science about this. It's not just, you don't just have to listen to dead lifetimes. So here's the, and I hinted at this already. It's been a really long time that feminist theorists have known this. Now they know this by arguing, by critiquing the patriarchy, right? This is a very different route. I described it as like, I'm coming up the other side of the mountain to meet these feminist theorists. So we are essentially with one another. We are essentially embodied beings. Feminist theorists have known this for a long time. I like to think that we can use these scientific tools of the patriarchy to fight the patriarchy. That's kind of my when I think of when I pat myself on the back that I'm doing good. I'm trying to do what feminists do from a different angle. And there are lots of particular things that follow from this. So if we take seriously this understanding of humans as necessarily embodied and necessarily with one another, and I left out the necessarily entooled, as necessarily connected to tools, including public languages. If you put all those things together, you start looking at what is it that how should we understand one another? How should we understand how we should treat one another? Well, what is that? You get rid of the kind of Kantian ideas about autonomy. And notice that we are not really autonomous. We are connected. And there have been theorists in the 21st century, especially in the last decade, talking about relational ontology. Relational autonomy. Right? So we have to understand what it is to be a thing that has a voice and authority and so on, without denying the necessary connectedness. That's what relational is. Second, we're basically second persons. My relationship with both people is as someone I'm currently interacting. I'm you to you, and you are you to me. And broadly speaking, care ethics is more important than any consequentialist ethics. Again, this is like phenomenology is in certain ways. This is very anti-Kant, right? So care ethics. There's no sense in which, in care ethics, there's no sense in which I owe more to humanity in general than I do to my child. My child is not an abstraction that I can compare to another human that I've never met. Right? My relationship to my child is special, and will often require violating what most ethicists think are kind of canons of fairness. I will give my child an extra cookie when they're home with people who eat cookies, because I have a different relationship with my child. That's okay. That's okay. Finally, I think that empathy, and this is an argument really with Jeff Prinz and Paul Bloom, who think empathy is really bad. It's irrational. I think empathy is the center of our ethical lives, including this kind of sensory motor engagement that I decided to call kind of the most basic kind of thing. Before we can think about one another as having experiences, before the theory or simulation theory comes into play, there's this way of interacting. Cool, done.
All right.